The Gospel of Mark.
Are we like the Pharisees? Mark 3 1 through 2. Hello. We're going to start studying Mark chapter 3 now. But first, let's go ahead and read chapter 3. When we finish that, we'll study verses 1 and 2. Before, we were looking in Mark in chapter 1, and Jesus had entered into the synagogue. And that's where the Jewish people went together and worshiped. Jesus preached there, and now Jesus is back at the synagogue. Again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. Mark 3 1. Jesus came from heaven. What for? Well, to save lost people. He would meet people, anyone, at the synagogue, on the seashore. Maybe it was on a boat he met people. We're reading in chapter 3, we're seeing various places that Jesus went and preached. In verse 1, it says that Jesus went to the synagogue and he saw a man with a withered hand. Again, he entered the synagogue and a man was there with a withered hand. Mark 3 1. That man, he needed healing. His hand was all withered up, and it would be hard for him to do things in a normal way. Work, could he do that? Well, maybe, maybe not. But for sure, we know that he needed help. He needed help from his family and friends and people he worked with to work on a farm, maybe milk the goats or whatever there was to do, because he needed food to eat. He needed clothes to wear and a place to live. We use our two hands, and that man, he only had one hand to use. It would be difficult for him. Jesus, he met many people, yes. Why? Well, he wanted to inform them the gospel of himself. He taught, he preached the gospel to anyone. Now, why was that important? Who was Jesus? Why was it important for people to know him? Was his message the truth? Well, he must show who he is. Now, how would he do that? By healing. And he also did other miracles, like he cast out demons. Now, at the synagogue, perhaps Jesus preached. Chapter 3 does not say that, so we're not for sure, but we know the Jewish people were there, and the Pharisees were there, and we know the scribes were there also. Now we continue to verse 2. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. Mark 3, verse 2. The religious leaders at the synagogue, they were watching Jesus. The Pharisees, they were used to people looking up to them, the Jewish people. They wanted them to obey their rules, and they did, even though they added things to them. They had authority over the Jewish people. Now, they were hearing and seeing Jesus, and the religious authorities didn't like it because the Jewish people, they were just drawn to Jesus. The religious leaders of the day, they were scared that Jesus was going to have more authority than them. And they were right, he did anyway. The Pharisees, they wanted to stop people from being drawn to Jesus. Those Pharisees, they had lots of biblical knowledge of the law, but they added rules to it that should not be there. They were strict in their teaching. The Pharisees, they were full of pride. They wanted to keep people, the Jewish people, looking up to them. They wanted to stay in power. Their motivation, the reason for their teaching of the Old Testament was wrong. The right reason should be teaching teaching that they cherish the word, the truth, the gospel, and not for people to look up to them. Is there another reason for teaching that they should have? Yes. Well, people needed to see God. They needed to see his character through them. That meant that they should be humble. Like pastors and biblical teachers and vloggers, they need to be humble. They need to be humble in their teaching of the word to touch people's heart so they will look to God. God's glory is something we can't even imagine. Pastors and teachers should never preach to bring glory for themselves. Do you and I want praise and pats on the back? Are our hearts right all the time? If we are truthful about ourselves, we confess, we agree, yes. We sometimes want people to be looking at us. In the back of our mind, we think, oh, I'm a good preacher, I'm a good teacher, same as the Pharisees said. We need to be close to God. How do we do that? Well, one is through reading God's Word. Secondly, through prayer. Third, we love other people through our actions, not just what we say. Those things will help us to remember that we are God's children. Okay, next time we're going to study verse 3 of chapter 3. Coram Deo.
To live coram deo is to live one's entire life in the presence of God, under the authority of God, to the glory of God. Everyday Breadcrumbs, Devotional Studies for the Deaf by Brad and Tammy Schaaf. Taught in American Sign Language by Brad and voiceover by his wife, Tammy. All verses are from English Standard Version. Brad Dale Schaaf at gmail.com.